Hello everyone and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Ninja Gaiden Black, a 3D action platforming title developed by Team Ninja and published by Tecmo for the Microsoft Xbox console back in 2005. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall. Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC, Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, Ham and Dagger, Mike Mitchell, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Ninja Gaiden Black, I figured it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose this game for today's episode. And the simple fact is, I didn't, because this is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by Vince Gameplays. Vince did record a message about why Ninja Gaiden Black means something to him. So Vince, take it away.
Hey guys, my name's Vince, and I have facial paralysis. So sometimes my words cannot slur, my lips don't touch, so it makes it hard to pronounce certain syllables, but I'll do my best to try and keep this short. I'm here today to talk about Ninja Gaiden. This game had a profound impact on me. Not only is it tough as nails, but it's as tough as it is, it's just equally, or if not more, cool. You play as a ninja, and you get to do flips, run on walls, cut people's heads off. It's absolutely insane. But just like life, it's challenging. And it taught me that not everything is a piece of cake. You don't always get a participation trophy, you know? And sometimes you just have to put in consistent effort and consistent trial and error to get something. But once you do, the sense of fulfillment and the sense of felt like you actually accomplished something is amazing. Now, this game is not a cakewalk. In fact, it's not always fair either. Unlike some like the Soul series are basically always fair. And most of the time it's your fault when you die. In this game, sometimes you just get put in a bad spot. Like, I'm pointing my finger at those non-throwing kunai ninjas. Those guys suck. Like, there's like 4 of them in a room, and there's just twirling kunai. Like, and they have bombs attached to them. And you can't block them. You just have to dodge. And sometimes that doesn't work. You just have to do the best you can with what you have. And that's what I love about this game, is it teaches you that not every game is a piece of cake. Not everything is a piece of cake. And that really helps me find my way through life. I want to take time to thank our wonderful host here for letting me be on this podcast. And I'm very interested to see what he has to say about this game, because it could either go really positive or maybe somewhere in between. Because as much as I love this game, it does have its lumps and lumps here and there.
Thank you, Vince, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Now, interestingly, I also have a little bit of experience with Ninja Gaiden Black from back when it first came out, but honestly, not a whole heck of a lot. From an overall perspective, thinking of the Ninja Gaiden series, I have I would say a really strong personal history with the original Ninja Gaiden. I remember playing Ninja Gaiden on the NES for hours when I was younger. I never actually beat it back then. I did eventually beat it when we had our episode on Ninja Gaiden, and that is a definite personal accomplishment because Ninja Gaiden can be a very challenging game until you get used to everything and you start memorizing all the levels and you know when the different enemies are going to pop onto the screen and how to avoid them and how to avoid falling into bottomless pits. It's a great game. But I love the original Ninja Gaiden. Beyond that first Ninja Gaiden, though, I've had fairly limited experience with other entries in the series. I mean, sure, I've played a little bit of Ninja Gaiden 2, I played a little bit of Ninja Gaiden 3, but nothing really crazy. And as we'll talk about in today's episode, after Ninja Gaiden 3, there was a bit of a lull in the Ninja Gaiden franchise. You had that trilogy of games on the NES, and then after that, not really anything that hit the threshold of being a real mass market kind of thing. That is until Ninja Gaiden got revived in the early 2000s. And specifically, Ninja Gaiden Black, released a little bit after the original Ninja Gaiden revival in 2005. When Ninja Gaiden Black came out, I did in fact buy the game because, well, a couple of reasons. One, I had an Xbox and I wanted to play more on my Xbox at the time because I was heavily involved in the games coming out for that system. Microsoft was a relatively new game console manufacturer and they had a ton of different games coming out for it, and I wanted to play as much as I could on that console. But secondly, it just looked cool. If you looked at the box and you saw Ninja Gaiden Black, I'm like, ooh, this is like a special edition kind of thing. So of course I bought the game. I bought it, I brought it home, I put it in my Xbox, I started playing it, and I bounced off of this game really hard. I thought it was too difficult. I didn't think it was rewarding enough. I just didn't really jive with the game. Now, granted, this was during a period of time before I had become enamored with challenging 3D games like Dark Souls, which, by the way, now I absolutely love. I love the Souls series. I love other pseudo open world and open world 3D experiences. Throw me a game that has a ton of challenge in it and I will devour it because I just simply enjoy those kinds of games. But back when Ninja Gaiden Black came out, I was not in that same headspace. I was not thinking about, oh, I want to sit down and really be challenged on something, or I want to experience super difficult gameplay. No, back around then, I was more interested in narrative experiences because, as anybody who has followed the podcast for a little bit knows, and anybody who just grew up around this era of gaming history knows, video game narratives had evolved over a period of time. And in the early 2000s, we were really getting some very, very interesting narrative experiences, super deep narratives, RPGs with gameplay and stories that we had never seen before. So that was where I was at in terms of my own personal gaming history. I wanted a game that had a really good story. That didn't mean it couldn't have action in it. Absolutely. I loved action games too, but I wanted something that was really going to grip me. I wanted a game I could sit down for hours and hours and experience something brand new from a narrative perspective. And for better or worse, when I played Ninja Gaiden Black back then, it just didn't grab me. It just felt a little bit too challenging, really not enough of a payoff, so I took it out of my Xbox, put it back on the shelf, and continued playing Knights of the Old Republic. I'm trying to remember, I think that was right around the time when I was playing Knights of the Old Republic for quite a bit. Oh, that's a great game. Wow. Anyway, this is not an episode on Knights of the Old Republic. So I had a little bit of experience with Ninja Gaiden Black, but not a ton. And then just last year, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound came out, a brand new 2D entry in the Ninja Gaiden franchise. And let me tell you, that game grabbed me. I loved Ninja Gaiden Ragebound. I played that thing through multiple times to unlock all of the different achievements and all that kind of stuff. It was such a great game. And as I was playing Ragebound, it rekindled my interest in the series. And then I started thinking to myself, well, maybe I do need to go back and play some of the earlier 3D Ninja Gaiden titles. Now, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound was not a 3D Ninja Gaiden game, but it was a Ninja Gaiden game. and I kind of wanted more Ninja Gaiden, so I thought to myself, I should probably go back and play some of those 3D titles from the earlier 2000s. And then Vince Gameplays said, hey, I want to sponsor an episode on Ninja Gaiden Black, which was pretty much perfect timing. I now had the perfect excuse to play the first 3D Ninja Gaiden title in earnest, and I was very excited. As I sat down to begin playing the game, I was curious if my impressions of Ninja Gaiden Black would be different today than when I first tried the title around 20 years ago, or if my initial impressions would remain, and Ninja Gaiden should have stayed a 2D exclusive masterpiece. That is just one of the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we begin diving deep into Ninja Gaiden Black. Ninja Gaiden Black is a 3D action platforming title developed by Team Ninja and published by Tecmo for the Microsoft Xbox console back in 2005. Before we can talk about Ninja Gaiden Black, we need to go back in time even further to talk about the creation of the Ninja Gaiden franchise, something which we did cover back in our episode on the very first Ninja Gaiden title a couple years ago, but warrants repeating today. Along the way, we'll talk about how Ninja Gaiden came to be, as well as how the franchise's two-dimensional roots would be reimagined as a 3D action experience, and would eventually result in the creation of our game of the day, Ninja Gaiden Black. So, let's talk about the origins of Ninja Gaiden as a gaming franchise. Before we begin though, it bears mentioning that Ninja Gaiden's origin story is a bit unique. We've talked before about games that started their life as an arcade title, only to be later ported to home consoles with various concessions and tweaks to the overall gameplay, graphics, story, and sound. In some cases, the home version of the title was actually subjectively better than the original arcade version of the game, which we saw when we discussed Contra a few years ago. Contra had originated as an arcade game and had a degree of success, but it was really the NES version of the game that garnered worldwide attention. Contra's arcade and home versions, though, were mostly the same game. The NES version was a true port of the arcade original, and was designed to mimic the arcade title, albeit with various changes to better match the capabilities of the NES hardware. It's not like the two games were designed as different experiences. I mention this because when we begin to talk about Ninja Gaiden, there's actually two intersecting stories we'll have to address. One is the creation of the arcade title, which followed fairly traditional arcade mechanics of the time. The other story, and the one that I find a bit more interesting, is the creation of the NES version of the title, which interestingly was a separate project entirely, and was designed not as a port of the arcade version, but was instead intended to be a standalone experience. As we begin our story, I'd like to focus first on the creation of the arcade title, but before we can do that, we have to take a look at the arcade market of the time, and specifically, the emergence of one of arcade gaming's most popular genres, the side-scrolling beat-em-up action game. It's hard to imagine a time when side-scrolling beat-em-ups didn't exist, and we've talked a few times previously about the genre. To start though, let's go back to what was effectively the beginning of the genre, and take a look at 1984's Kung Fu Master. Kung Fu Master was designed by legendary game designer Takashi Nishiyama, who in later years would become famous for designing the very first Street Fighter title. Back in 1984 though, Nishiyama was an employee of the IREM Corporation, and Kung Fu Master was just the second title that he would be tasked with working on. Considered by many to be the grandfather of the beat-em-up genre, Kung Fu Master would present players with a purely side-scrolling two-dimensional experience, where you'd control an expert martial artist as he traverses several stages filled with a variety of bad guys, obstacles, and bosses, all in the hopes of saving your kidnapped girlfriend. Similar in many ways to other side-perspective fighting-based games like Karateka, albeit decidedly less cinematic, Kung Fu Master would be one of the first titles that emphasized combat mechanics over traditional platforming elements as the core focus of the title. And even though it was fairly primitive by today's standards, you can very easily see how the game's design was effectively an early blueprint for what would eventually become the beat-em-up genre. While Kung Fu Master may have been the first true beat-em-up game, it wasn't until 1986 when the beat-em-up genre would really come into its own, and that happened with the release of Renegade. Renegade was an arcade title created by Technos Japan, and would serve to introduce many of the common beat-em-up features that we now take for granted, such as a much more advanced fighting and combat system, where you could dash, grapple, throw, and pummel your opponents into submission. Similarly important to the evolution of the genre was the inclusion of depth in the game world, meaning, rather than simply walking left and right on the screen, you had the ability to walk further back into the environment, or closer to the screen, effectively introducing the use of what's known as the Z-axis to the beat-em-up genre, which would open up many more gameplay opportunities than were previously available. Beyond those mechanical evolutions though, Renegade would become known for one other key contribution to the genre. It would become one of the first side-scrolling beat-em-up titles to introduce urban settings, with the player navigating the mean streets of a city with the intent of beating up gangs of bad guys in the hopes of eventually saving the day. Prior to Renegade, most beat-em-ups, like Kung Fu Master, utilized settings that mimicked the very traditional Kung Fu kinds of environments that were prevalent in martial arts movies, like karate dojos, picturesque mountaintops, and serene meditation grottos. Renegade switched things up by introducing a more urban city-based setting where gang warfare, rather than honor-driven kung fu, was the name of the game. The work completed on Renegade would eventually lead to an even more influential title a year later, also developed by Technos Japan. That game, Double Dragon, would effectively be the spiritual successor to Renegade, and would inherit many of its features, like a fleshed-out combat system, urban warfare kinds of environments, and the inclusion of a game world with depth, as opposed to just horizontal scrolling. Beyond those mechanics though, Double Dragon would go on to introduce several additional features to the beat-em-up genre that had never been attempted before, including the ability to disarm an enemy and then use his own weapon against him, cutscenes in between levels to add a more cinematic feel to the game, and perhaps most importantly, the introduction of multiplayer combat. That's right, Double Dragon was the first beat-em-up game that enabled cooperative gameplay. Before Double Dragon, every beat-em-up was simply a one-player affair. Just think about that for a second. How much more fun is it to play beat-em-ups with a buddy? Without Double Dragon, we may have never known that joy. While the reasoning behind that multiplayer design decision was largely capitalistic, in that the development team figured they'd make more money if two people were playing at a time rather than one, the impact would be incredibly influential. Nearly every beat-em-up title from that point on would include cooperative multiplayer as a base feature of the game. Beyond its innovations, Double Dragon would go on to spawn numerous sequels that would influence countless games to follow, and one of those games, as you might have already surmised, was the arcade version of Ninja Gaiden. On the surface, the Ninja Gaiden arcade game appears to be a simple evolution of the Double Dragon formula. You fight through a number of stages, either solo or with a buddy ninja companion, with the goal of defeating an evil cult trying to bring about the end of the world. Along the way, you'll punch, kick, and throw an assortment of enemies who attempt to get in your way, while you jump, climb, and swing your way through 6 levels of ninja action gameplay. That description makes it sound just a little bit like Double Dragon, but with ninjas. And honestly, you'd kind of be right if you made that assumption. The thing is though, ninjas were a pretty big deal in pop culture at the time, as were arcades. So if you mixed the two with any degree of expertise, you'd almost be guaranteed a hit. And Ninja Gaiden was certainly a hit when it released to the arcades in 1988, quickly becoming one of the top-grossing arcade games of the time, with many critics declaring it a successor to Double Dragon's beat-em-up throne. While many recognized that the game and its mechanics weren't exactly unique, there was also recognition that the gameplay, graphics, and overall fun of the title were still something to be commended, despite feeling that the game was a bit unoriginal. Plus, it had ninjas. Given its success in the arcades, it's probably not a surprise to discover that this particular version of Ninja Gaiden would be ported to a number of home systems, including the Amiga, Commodore 64, IBM PC-compatible computers, and the Atari Lynx portable console. Interestingly, in Europe, the game would be rebranded as Shadow Warriors, driven primarily by many European countries censoring the word ninja pretty extensively in the 1980s and even into the 90s, especially when used in conjunction with any entertainment product that could potentially be targeted at children. The thought there, by the way, was that the term ninja implied violence, oftentimes associated with assassination. So many European nations of the time, particularly the UK, decided to avoid using the term wherever possible. So, games like Ninja Gaiden became Shadow Warriors. Media properties like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. And movies like Three Ninjas Kick Back became a poor decision made by some film production company trying to make a quick buck. Okay, so maybe that last one doesn't quite fit, but regardless, Ninja Gaiden, or Shadow Warriors depending on how you may have known it, garnered significant attention in the arcades and continued to generate a degree of buzz even with its home ports. It was considered one of the better beat-em-up titles of its time, and many players teamed up in both arcades as well as the comfort of their living rooms to try to clean up the streets, ninja style. Now, the observant amongst you might be saying, well, okay, cool. Ninja Gaiden was ported to a bunch of systems after its arcade release. But you haven't mentioned the Nintendo version of the title, which is arguably the most well-known version of the game. So come on, what gives? And to that, I would reply, well, you're right. We haven't talked about the NES version of the game, primarily because the NES version of Ninja Gaiden was an entirely different, or at least mostly different, game than its arcade counterpart. In yet another example of two similar games not actually being direct ports of one another, which we saw most recently when we discussed Super Punch-Out and the Punch-Out franchise in general. Ninja Gaiden's eventual release on the NES would differ dramatically from the arcade Ninja Gaiden game. So, let's talk about how that particular version of the game came to be. What you may not know, and what was a rarity in the 80s, was that Ninja Gaiden for the NES was developed concurrently with its arcade big brother, and was always intended to be a standalone experience, mostly unrelated to the arcade title. To bring that version of the title to life, Tecmo turned to two of the newer members of its internal team, Masato Kato and Hideo Yoshizawa. Masato Kato has had a long and varied career, with perhaps his best-known work coming in the 90s through his employment with RPG developer Square, during which time he'd be responsible for scripting both Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, along with several other role-playing game assignments. Back in the late 80s, though, Kato was simply a recent college graduate who had acquired a job at Tecmo as a graphics artist, and once joining Tecmo, it didn't take long for him to receive his very first real development project. He was asked to join a team to work on a brand new ninja action game concept, with another relatively new employee, Hideo Yoshizawa, being the game's director. Like I mentioned earlier, the concept of ninjas was experiencing a significant growth in popularity around this time, particularly in North America, and because of that popularity, Tecmo leadership decided that they didn't want to create only one ninja title, which was the already in development Ninja Gaiden arcade game. They wanted to create two, with the second one being an NES exclusive. And it was this NES exclusive title that would become the game Kato and Yoshizawa would be assigned to work on. Early on, discussions centered on what their game was actually going to be like. Both men had awareness of the Ninja Gaiden arcade title that another team at Tecmo was working on, and they considered that it might be possible to simply port that title over to the NES. But here, Yoshizawa ended up having a different idea entirely. Yoshizawa recognized that, generally speaking, people playing arcade games were typically trying to get a high score, to be able to add their names to the game's online leaderboard and, by extension, earn bragging rights amongst other arcade goers. The concept of a story in an arcade title was a bit of a rarity in the 80s. And in fact, even in games that have a degree of story, like titles that allow level progression through a number of different scenes, ultimately culminating in some sort of boss fight, the story was really secondary to both the gameplay and the score. Sure, you could have a loose narrative framework for your title, but in the arcades, especially in the late 80s, the goal of nearly every arcade game was to get the highest score possible, not experience a strong narrative and story. This general gameplay and score over story concept was almost directly applied to many home console titles released around the same time, and it's not very difficult to see why. Arcade games, generally speaking, predated home consoles, so when the time came for video game developers to begin releasing titles in the home, they pretty much had one source of inspiration: the games that were prevalent in arcades. So, a lot of home console releases, especially in the 8-bit era of gaming, were very arcade-centric kinds of experiences. While you did have some titles with deeper plots and alternate mechanics, the vast majority of home games were variations on what players had seen in arcades for years. Yoshizawa considered that an arcade title simply ported to a home console might be fun, but wouldn't ultimately be that deep of an experience. For one, arcade titles are usually fairly short in length, which makes sense considering that their existence relied upon single plays at a quarter apiece. Console titles, by contrast, required a significantly higher, albeit one-time, investment, and players expected to get a fair amount of gameplay out of that investment. Secondly, like we talked about, arcade titles usually had only the thinnest of plots to propel the action forward, which might work when you're playing a few minutes at a time, but might not be the best experience when you're sitting down in your living room, ready to become immersed in a new game. And thirdly, there was a commonly held belief across Tecmo leadership that any console game had to hit a certain level of difficulty, with the assumption that if a game wasn't difficult enough, players would simply throw it away, never to return to it, or even worse, rent a game for a weekend and end up never buying it in the first place. With those three considerations in mind, Yoshizawa and the team set out to begin creating their NES Ninja game, known as Ninja Ryukenden, which translates into English as Legend of the Dragon Sword. As the team sat down to actually create the game, they basically threw away every aspect of the Ninja Gaiden arcade game and started from scratch, other than inheriting some very loose elements of the arcade experience, like the rough design of the game's first stage. Beyond that, though, nearly everything would be a unique, Nintendo-focused design decision. Rather than create a beat-em-up title in the style of Double Dragon, Yoshizawa and the team decided to create a more traditional two-dimensional platforming action title, reminiscent in many ways to Konami's Castlevania. And actually, if you put a screenshot of the two side by side, you might just think that the two games shared the same engine, with a number of Ninja Ryukenden's design elements appearing to be almost directly copied from Castlevania. As a few examples, both the players' and bosses' hit points were depicted in nearly the same way, albeit occupying different sides of the screen. Instead of a whip, the main character of Ninja Ryukenden would use a katana, albeit with the same basic gameplay mechanics for defeating enemies included. Even the special power-up system in Ninja Ryukenden would be copied from Castlevania, albeit with different items available that better fit in with the ninja aesthetic. As an example, a ninja wouldn't throw holy water, but he certainly would throw a shuriken. Despite the difference in items though, the actual mechanic of using those special items was pretty much identical between the two games. And speaking of the ninja aesthetic, a ninja game wouldn't be a ninja game unless it starred, a ninja. And here, Yoshizawa and the team created a protagonist that would end up having a long-lasting legacy. That character, of course, was Ryu Hayabusa, the wielder of the legendary Dragon Sword, and son of famed ninja Joe Hayabusa. When the team sat down to design Ryu, they knew that they didn't want to create just any old ninja. They wanted to make the character unique and distinct. So, rather than cover Ryu up in traditional ninja clothes with most of his body obscured from sight, Ryu would get a sleeveless ninja vest to accentuate his muscles. They also wrote a fairly extensive backstory for the character, which ultimately would end up becoming the plot for the game. And oh boy, what a plot it was, especially for an 8-bit Nintendo title. Like we talked about, the majority of titles released around this time were not necessarily focused on emphasizing story, especially action and platforming titles, which were really designed for the experience of playing the game, not the narrative quality. Think about a game like Castlevania. You knew you were playing a vampire hunter, and you knew that your goal was to find and defeat Dracula. But beyond that, there really wasn't much in the way of character motivation, backstory, lore, dialogue, or anything like that. It was simply you, a vampire hunter, against a horde of monsters. Ninja Ryukenden was designed differently, and the team chose to focus an extensive amount of effort on the story for the game. In a move that was pretty unique for the time, Ninja Ryukenden would be split up into 6 distinct acts, taking inspiration from movies, and before each act, a fully developed cutscene would play. And these cutscenes were not simply static text and images. They were animated, detailed, almost cinematic sequences, or at least as close to cinematic sequences as you could get with an 8-bit console in the 1980s. And the cutscenes didn't just present a simple basic story. There was intrigue, there was drama, there was double-crossing, there was revenge, and all of the scenes were presented and framed as though they were being filmed. In essence, Ninja Ryukenden was trying to tell a ninja story, and it was trying to do that by creating what was effectively a ninja movie in the game. If you add it all up, Ninja Ryukenden ended up having over 20 minutes of pure cutscenes, an absolutely unheard of length of time for a game in this era of gaming history. This focus on cinematic story presentation was driven primarily by Yoshizawa's prior career aspirations, because when he was in college, he originally wanted to become a filmmaker, and he had high hopes that he would be able to eventually make a career in the movie business. This ended up not playing out the way he intended, but still, as a video game director, he had the freedom to try to weave his cinematic flair into the game itself, similar in many ways to how Hideo Kojima always wanted to make films, but instead has more often applied his Hollywood ambitions to video game design. The cutscene mechanics that Yoshizawa and the team built into Ninja Ryukenden were so well received, in fact, that Tecmo would end up taking that system and using it for future titles. Dubbed the Tecmo Theater System, any game that utilized this particular tool would be designed similarly to Ninja Ryukenden, with each title using a horizontally split display where the top half of the screen would be animated graphics, with the bottom half of the screen being text and other story-driven elements. The Tecmo Theater system would end up being used in 7 games overall over the course of its existence, spanning ninja action platformers, soccer or football sports titles, and full-fledged role-playing games. So Yoshizawa's innovation definitely ended up being well used by the rest of Tecmo's staff. Regarding the gameplay mechanics, beyond inheriting a lot of the core features from Castlevania, there was one overriding design goal amongst the team. Ninja Ryukenden had to be a difficult experience, which, like we talked about, was a core tenet of the Tecmo leadership team of the time. The general thought there was, the game's target audience was not the casual pick up a game and play for a few minutes kind of crowd. The target audience here was people who played games every day as one of, if not their sole, hobby. These players, Tecmo believed, played games for the reward of accomplishing a seemingly impossible task. By overcoming a game's challenges, these individuals would feel a sense of accomplishment that by itself would be reason enough to play a game. In effect, the challenge of the experience was as important, if not more so, than every other aspect of the game. So, the development team set out to create a punishingly difficult experience, complete with respawning enemies, tricky platforming jumps, bottomless pits, and bosses with damaging and nearly unavoidable attacks, at least later in the game. The difficulty of Ninja Ryukenden would be so high that it would routinely be referenced in many gamers' hardest games of all time lists. And interestingly, one of the most difficult portions of the game was caused by a seemingly unintentional glitch. The very final stage of the game, Act 6, features perhaps the most difficult series of levels in the entire game. In it, the player has to traverse 3 different substages, all of which require pinpoint platforming while defeating and avoiding a number of irritatingly difficult enemies with tricky attack patterns and placements. Assuming you get past those 3 substages, you begin what can best be described as a boss gauntlet, where you have to beat not 1, not 2, but 3 different bosses, all of which have different attacks and patterns to adjust to. Here's the kicker though. If you fail at one of the bosses, and by fail here I mean die once, you end up going all the way back to the beginning of Act 6, requiring you to replay the 3 super difficult substages again before being allowed to once again tackle the boss gauntlet. When compared to the rest of the game, many players believed this was unfair, as normally if you fail in a boss fight, you can continue from the immediately preceding substage. So in this instance, the normal game behavior if you lost to a boss would be to restart from the beginning of substage 6-3, which was definitely a punishment, but not torture. Instead, you got sent all the way back to stage 6-1, and you had to begin the painful process of making your way back to the boss, all over again. Only the thing is, going all the way back to stage 6-1 is actually a glitch in the game. It was never intended to happen. Dying to a boss on the final stage was supposed to reset you back to stage 6-3, just like every other freaking boss fight in the game. But no, because of this glitch, the game had its difficulty ramped up significantly, even more so than what its base mechanics intended. And even beyond that, the development team knew this glitch existed in the game. Masato Kato is on record, yes, on record, as saying that the team discovered the glitch, but that rather than correct it for the final game release, they decided to leave it in as a, and I quote, feature. I don't know if I should golf clap that decision or punch a wall, because I respect the focus on difficulty as well as the sheer good luck everyone attitude on display here. But at the same time, when I played Ninja Gaiden a couple years ago, I had to experience the pain of dealing with the entirety of Act 6 every time I died to the boss. So yeah, just a little bit conflicted. Anyway, eventually all of the pieces for the game would come together, and Ninja Ryukenden would release on the Nintendo Famicom system in Japan in December of 1988, where it was met with nearly universal critical acclaim. That game would, of course, make its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America as well, but not until March of the following year. And interestingly, in its transition to the NES, the game would undergo a name change. While we've talked about the game's difficulty and the fact that the developers basically said, the harder, the better, one thing they thought was just too difficult, at least for American players, was how to pronounce Ninja Ryukenden. And so, when the title would be ported to North America and the NES, Ninja Ryukenden would be rechristened as, you guessed it, Ninja Gaiden. Now that wasn't the only change that accompanied the North American release, as the game still needed to be localized and translated for English-speaking audiences. So you might think, well okay, hand the text files to a couple of skilled translators, have them write out some English and add it to the game, and then done. Here's your game. Unfortunately for the development team though, the reality of the situation was much more complex. When we talk about the NES, we have to realize that there were pretty strict image size and resolution requirements in order for the graphics of a given game to actually be displayable on a television screen. Because of those limitations, developers didn't have an unlimited number of characters to use for text, and oftentimes in the translation from Japanese kanji symbols into English text, compromises had to be made to even fit the English characters onto the screen, which often meant rewording various phrases and in some cases shortening the text to be more succinct. That by itself would be enough to make localization a bit tricky, and considering the amount of text and the number of cutscenes in the game, there was definitely more translation and compromise needed here than many NES games of the time. Here though, things were even trickier, as the text in the game wasn't actually stored as text, it was stored as image files. Which meant, rather than simply translating text, the team needed to recompose all of the images associated with that text, a time-consuming process that served to extend the amount of work needed to complete the NES port of the game. Regardless of the difficulty associated with localizing the game, though, North America and the rest of the NES game-playing world would eventually be able to play Ninja Gaiden in March of 1989. And similar to the Japanese release, players and critics would absolutely love the game, with many praising the game's graphics, cutscenes, gameplay, and overall presentation. Numerous media outlets would name the game as one of the best releases of the year, and over time, Ninja Gaiden would make its way onto many people's best games of all time list. Even Hideo Yoshizawa, the game's director, would go on to state that the creation of Ninja Ryu Kenden, or Ninja Gaiden, depending on where you're from, would be one of the proudest achievements of his video game development career. In fact, it was so well received that Nintendo Power gave Ninja Gaiden what amounted to free advertising for a good year or two following its release, as the game ended up being featured in various sections of the magazine multiple times. Ninja Gaiden, in short, was a beloved masterpiece. Given how much people loved the game, you'd imagine that Ninja Gaiden would have quite the legacy, and you would be right. Ninja Gaiden spawned 2 direct sequels on the NES, a port to the PC Engine in Japan, a remake along with its sequels for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, soundtrack CDs, and even a series of novelizations by the Scholastic Corporation, which I vividly recall being available at my local school book fair back in the early 90s. And across all of those two-dimensionally focused efforts, the overall response would be very similar to the response to the very first Ninja Gaiden title in the NES. Critics and players alike enjoyed all of those Ninja Gaiden games, and those certain titles in the series might have amped the difficulty up just a bit too far. Ninja Gaiden 3. Sorry about that. The simple fact is that the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy of titles were beloved by countless gamers around the world, and in the eyes of many, represent some of the best two-dimensional action platforming experiences ever created. Considering how much success the original trilogy of Ninja Gaiden titles had experienced, you might assume that Tecmo would simply continue making games in the Ninja Gaiden franchise. Only here, you would be very wrong, as after the release of Ninja Gaiden 3 for the NES in 1991, work on original Ninja Gaiden titles effectively ended, with only a couple of side project efforts greenlit through 1992, after which the franchise went completely dormant. Now, some of you might be wondering why Tecmo would shelve one of their more popular franchises, especially given the fact that the early to mid-90s saw a rapid expansion in the technological capabilities of computers and home consoles, which you might assume would mean that a new Ninja Gaiden using those new technological capabilities would be a surefire hit. Unfortunately, though, that wouldn't be in the cards, because as the mid-90s rolled around, Tecmo found itself in a situation it had not anticipated, and one that could have effectively shut the company down if immediate action wasn't taken. Tecmo had made a name for themselves throughout the 80s and early 90s, both through a series of high-quality arcade releases, as well as a number of high-profile, incredibly successful titles released on Nintendo's 8-bit Famicom and NES console ecosystem. And some of those NES classics, like the Ninja Gaiden series, as well as the quote-unquote Tecmo line of sports titles, like Tecmo Bowl and Tecmo Super Bowl, sold insanely well on the market. In fact, those games sold well enough to pretty much sustain the entire company and allow it to expand, as brand new, albeit not necessarily mainstream popular games continue to be developed, published, and released. As the video game world started to shift away from the NES and towards 16-bit powerhouses like the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo Entertainment Systems, Tecmo had to figure out a way to bridge the gap from their successful 8-bit efforts to, hopefully, even more successful 16-bit releases. The unfortunate fact, though, is that the company had significant trouble bridging that gap. To better illustrate the kind of situation the company found itself in, we're going to look at a specific example: the release of Tecmo Super Bowl and its eventual sequel on the Super NES. Tecmo Super Bowl originally came out on the NES back in 1991, and was itself the successor to the classic football title Tecmo Bowl, which had hit NES store shelves in 1989. Tecmo Bowl was an instant sensation and commercial juggernaut, earning rave reviews while being named one of the best and most addicting football video games to ever be released up to that point in history. And in the eyes of many, Tecmo Super Bowl had been an even greater achievement, and improved upon the original in nearly every conceivable way. Both of those titles, beyond being loved by countless gamers around the world, were also commercially successful, with Tecmo Bowl selling over 1.5 million copies after its release in 1989, and Tecmo Super Bowl selling just a smidge under 1.2 million copies itself, both of which were good enough to be considered blockbuster releases for the company. With such success, it probably wouldn't be a surprise to learn that Tecmo would attempt to repeat that success on the Super NES, and in fact, they would release a version of Tecmo Super Bowl in Japan in 1993 on the Super Famicom, and would follow that effort up with a Super NES sequel in 1994. Considering how well Tecmo Bowl and Tecmo Super Bowl had sold on the NES, it stands to reason that an improved 16-bit version could potentially sell as well or even better than its 8-bit parents. Only here, that is not what happened. Tecmo Super Bowl on the Super NES ended up selling 13,000 copies, and its sequel wouldn't fare much better, selling under 50,000 copies following its release. Beyond being disappointing numbers for the company, they were also a cause for broader concern, as the high sales Tecmo had enjoyed during its 8-bit heyday appeared to be coming to a close in the 16-bit era of gaming. This lack of sales relative to prior performance hit the company hard, and by the time the mid-90s rolled around, Tecmo was in a pretty dire financial position. They needed to create a hit fast, or they ran the risk of potentially needing to close their doors forever. Tecmo leadership began soliciting ideas for new, hopefully blockbuster games, and a variety of individuals came forward with concepts for games that could potentially sell, but weren't necessarily surefire blockbusters, and leadership at the company was hesitant to bankroll any game around this time that wasn't guaranteed to be a hit. That is, until a young programmer named Tomonobu Itagaki made a proposal for a new fighting game concept that Tecmo leadership believed might have some potential. Itagaki had gotten his start with Tecmo in 1992, and had proven himself to be a talented programmer in the years following his hiring. When the call for brand new video game ideas came out from the company leadership, Itagaki came up with a concept that he thought would be a surefire winner, and one that, given the state of the arcade gaming market of the time, would almost surely be commercially successful. One of the more popular styles of arcade game in the mid-90s was the 3D one-on-one tournament fighter, a genre popularized by Sega and its hugely successful Virtua Fighter series. While countless gamers flocked to arcades to play Sega's latest 3D fighting games, Itagaki had a somewhat different take. He was unimpressed by the more realistic, so to speak, style of arcade fighting games, and he longed for an opportunity to create a game that would return to the genre's roots, being focused less on realistic martial arts and more on over-the-top arcade-styled action. He brought this concept to Tecmo leadership, thinking there was no way they'd reject his idea, though surprisingly, there wasn't nearly as much support for the concept as what Itagaki had expected. So, he did the only thing a young brash game designer could do in such a situation. He made a literal wager with the leadership team that his game would garner a fan base. Now, it's not exactly clear what the wager was, but I'm assuming it had to be something significant, because shortly after this challenge was issued, Tecmo leadership did in fact agree to let Itagaki develop his fighting game idea into a full-fledged game, which is what would eventually result in the creation of the hit fighting game franchise, Dead or Alive. Dead or Alive would in fact become a hit for the company, and would almost single-handedly turn Tecmo's fortunes around. To put it into perspective, in 1995, Tecmo had posted an annual loss of $5.2 million, and if 1996 was similar, they would have almost certainly had to have declared bankruptcy. Dead or Alive came out in late 1996, but still early enough in Tecmo's fiscal year to have a potential impact. And let me tell you, it did have an impact. A $5.2 million loss in 1995 turned into a $9.2 million profit in 1996, driven almost exclusively by Dead or Alive's popularity in arcades around the world. With Tecmo now effectively off life support, attention turned to how to capitalize on this newfound success, and as you might imagine, Home ports of the title would follow, along with a promotion for the game's creator, Tomonobu Itagaki. As home ports of Dead or Alive got underway, Tecmo decided to formalize the group that Itagaki had been leading as a true separate division in the company, complete with its own name and brand identity. Which is why, after Dead or Alive's smash debut in 1996, the group of developers and designers that were previously known only as Tecmo Creative No. 3 would now be known as Team Ninja, and would be led by Itagaki. As Team Ninja formally began its existence, the division's focus was squarely on continuing to release successful games, which meant more Dead or Alive titles, as Itagaki and the team would follow 1996's Dead or Alive with Dead or Alive 2 in 1999, Dead or Alive 3 in 2001, and Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball in 2003, each of which were pretty darn successful and served to keep Team Ninja, and Tecmo by extension, on solid ground following the mid-90s financial issues that had plagued the company. Itagaki and Team Ninja were on a roll, and from the outside looking in, it certainly appeared that the group would continue to maintain its singular focus, that being the creation of more Dead or Alive titles. If we pull back the curtain a little bit though, it becomes clear that appearances can be deceiving. Because, while Team Ninja was in the midst of releasing Dead or Alive 2 in 1999, the company had secretly been working on a brand new project, and one that they hoped would demonstrate even further just how talented this group of designers, developers, artists, and other creatives could be, while also taking a beloved franchise from Tecmo's own history to, once again, thrust it into the spotlight. That secret project was known internally as the Next Generation Ninja Gaiden project, and early work on the title was focused on creating an arcade release of a modernized version of Ninja Gaiden, the series that Tecmo had all but abandoned following its trilogy of titles for the NES. As work progressed though, the team thought that a home release would make more sense than an arcade exclusive, so work on this new version of Ninja Gaiden would be shifted to instead be designed for the Sega Dreamcast, which isn't too much of a surprise considering the original arcade version of the game was being designed for the Sega Naomi arcade board, and the Dreamcast and Naomi board shared pretty much the same underlying architecture, making the development shift a pretty painless process. That, however, would not be the last development shift the game would see, as shortly after making the decision to develop the next generation of Ninja Gaiden for the Dreamcast, Sega declared that they were exiting the home console business entirely, which meant that releasing any game for the now dying Dreamcast platform would, by definition, be a limited release. So, the team decided to shift their development to Sony's PlayStation 2 console, where they hoped to be a launch day title for the system. Even though the Sony PS2 had not launched yet, Team Ninja felt pretty confident in this change of direction, because considering the popularity of the original PlayStation, the PS2 would almost certainly not be a dying platform, and interestingly, the PS2 would eventually become the best-selling home console of all time. Of course, Team Ninja didn't know the PS2 would become so successful. They just knew that the PS2 was almost certainly going to be a better home for their new Ninja Gaiden game than the end-of-life Sega Dreamcast. And with this new direction, the team continued working on their forthcoming title. Surprisingly, however, development focus would shift yet again, as Team Ninja leader Tomonobu Itagaki had become impressed with another console's development toolkit, that being Microsoft's first foray into the home console market, the Xbox. Itagaki was very keen to release a game for the Xbox console, and believed that the system's power and programmer-friendly development kit would enable Team Ninja to create the best, most visceral, and engaging Ninja Gaiden title of all time. So, development focus shifted yet again, this time landing on the Xbox, which would end up being the final home for this new Ninja Gaiden experience. Interestingly, Itagaki and the rest of Team Ninja kept the forthcoming game's targeted launch console a secret, until finally unveiling their decision at the 2002 Electronics Entertainment Expo, or E3, and declaring that the title now known simply as Ninja Gaiden would be released as a Microsoft Xbox exclusive. While fans of the series were surprised, especially considering how closely the Ninja Gaiden franchise had previously been associated with Nintendo, everyone kept an open mind, because this was a new Ninja Gaiden, and it was going to be a very new take on the traditional Ninja Gaiden formula. Leveraging the power of the Xbox console, Team Ninja envisioned a game that would take full advantage of three-dimensional technology, making a game with the kind of graphics and gameplay that the 8-bit NES original series would never have been capable of, including a level of violence that Itagaki believed would appeal to Western audiences, though would never have been allowed in an NES game. While this new iteration of Ninja Gaiden was intended to take inspiration from Tecmo's earliest efforts, it was also being viewed as an entirely new experience, and Team Ninja didn't feel constrained by being associated with the franchise. In fact, early designs for the Xbox version of Ninja Gaiden deviated pretty extensively from the original trilogy, with Tecmo eventually persuading Itagaki and the team to make more of an explicit connection between the themes of the original series and this new Ninja Gaiden reboot. Itagaki saw the business sense in making Ninja Gaiden more like Ninja Gaiden, so he and the team reworked some of the game's design to make it more clear that yes, this was a Ninja Gaiden game. It was just a brand new take on the franchise, and one that Team Ninja hoped would resonate with gamers around the world. Ninja Gaiden would eventually release on the Microsoft Xbox console in early 2004, and upon its release, the game would be critically acclaimed, with many publications naming this new version of Ninja Gaiden as one of the best third-person action-adventure experiences ever created. Players, meanwhile, would flock to the title, elated that they now had a new Ninja Gaiden game to play, and also impressed with just how good this new version of Ninja Gaiden was, with clear ties to the past, but a decidedly different design that pointed towards a potentially even brighter future. Team Ninja was delighted that their new game was successful, and they wanted to continue supporting it post-launch however they could, with the goal of creating the best action experience anyone had ever seen. This goal led to the creation of 2 free expansions entitled Hurricane Packs, which would dramatically change the overall game. The first Hurricane Pack would feature a revised version of the original game's story mode, complete with new encounters, brand new enemy types, and even tweaks to the game's controls, including allowing the player to now change the game's camera angles, which had been automatic in the original release of the title. Hurricane Pack 2 would similarly introduce a new gameplay mode, and would even add 2 additional bosses to the overall experience, providing players with even more content to sink their teeth into. Even beyond those expansions, though, Team Ninja wasn't done working on Ninja Gaiden, as they would end up bundling those expansions together while adding even more content for players to enjoy, along with additional gameplay tweaks, extra game modes, and new difficulty settings, and would eventually combine all of that goodness into a single package for players to experience. That effort is what would result in the creation of the definitive version of Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox, which would release in 2005 as Ninja Gaiden Black. Ninja Gaiden Black was widely considered to be the best version of Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox console, and would, even more than the original release from a year prior, be critically acclaimed and commercially successful, earning even more critical praise and, along with the original version, selling over 1.5 million copies in the 2 years following its release. Interestingly, Team Ninja would continue enhancing Ninja Gaiden even further, with an eventual PS3 release with even more tweaks following in 2007, known as Ninja Gaiden Sigma, and finally a PlayStation Vita port of the game in 2012 called Ninja Gaiden Sigma Plus. Alongside those reworked releases, Team Ninja was also hard at work continuing to develop brand new Ninja Gaiden games, and as of this recording, Ninja Gaiden remains a very popular franchise, with the latest Team Ninja developed title, Ninja Gaiden 4, having just released in 2025 to stellar reviews, clearly showing that there is certainly a bright future for the franchise. While many of the individuals who worked on the original version of Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox, along with Ninja Gaiden Black, are no longer associated with Team Ninja, their legacy remains embedded with the franchise, with perhaps Tomonobu Itagaki's being the most deeply embedded of all. Unfortunately, Itagaki passed away in late 2025 at the age of 58, a truly sad event for fans of his work, and a significant loss to the gaming industry at large. While Itagaki's passing is certainly unfortunate, the fact that we can all continue to experience and enjoy his prior work is a comfort, and is arguably one of the more important releases of his entire career, Ninja Gaiden Black represents the efforts of a lead designer and talented staff firing on all cylinders, a game that in the eyes of many is as close to action gaming nirvana as any game has ever reached, past or present. My question, as I sat down to begin playing Ninja Gaiden Black for this episode of the podcast, is whether the game is truly as good as everyone claims, or if my initial impressions of the title, which were less than kind, are a more accurate reflection of its overall quality. That is just one of the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we dive even deeper into Ninja Gaiden Black. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Ninja Gaiden Black today versus when it was released back in 2005. Ninja Gaiden Black is, like we've been talking about, a 3D action platforming, somewhat adventurous kind of experience. As you play the game, you'll notice that, at least in the main story mode, there are multiple chapters that you'll progress through, and we're going to talk about each of the different modes in the game later on. But for the purposes of our overview right now, just recognize in the story mode, you will have multiple chapters that you can play through. And the game itself is based on several discrete gameplay elements. One of those is third-person action-adventure platforming, where you can run, jump, solve some light puzzles, and attack, as you might expect when you hear the phrase 3D action platformer. There are a lot of things, though, here that are deeper than that description would indicate, and we're going to talk about each element of the game in detail, along with what I liked and what I didn't about each aspect of the game. And we're going to start by talking about the platforming. In Ninja Gaiden Black, you can move around mostly freely through a variety of 3D environments. Now, because you are a ninja, this doesn't just involve jumping and running from place to place, because ninjas have way cooler ways of navigating environments than your traditional platforming hero. This is not going to be a Mario-like experience where you jump, you might jump on some heads, maybe you climb up a block here or there and you continue progressing through a level. Oh no, in Ninja Gaiden, you are in fact a ninja, which means you can move through levels way more stylistically than what nearly any other platformer can give you. So, as a ninja, you can run around your environment, but you can also run up and across walls because ninjas are able to wall run and wall jump. This is actually going to become critical as we progress into the combat portion of the discussion, so just keep that in mind. You can also jump off of walls. Basically, you can step up and then kick or jump off of a wall to attack opponents or just to move to other platforming areas. There are some sections of the game that have sort of a side-to-side wall jump kind of section where it's similar to what you might see in other platforming titles like Super Metroid or Mario, where you can kind of jump from one side of the wall to the next and kind of almost ping-pong your way up a wall, or two walls rather, to get to a higher section of a given stage. You can do that here, but like I said, you are a ninja, which means you can do that probably easier than a mustachioed plumber. You can also hang off and pull yourself across ledges or ropes or other overhead environmental objects. You can also swim in the game, though I will say the swimming in Ninja Gaiden Black is not my favorite part of the experience. The swimming here felt a little cumbersome, especially when you combine it with the controls, which are not what I would consider perfect 3D movement-based controls. There is swimming here. It works fine once you get used to it, but the swimming is definitely an aspect of the platforming section of the game that I just did not particularly enjoy. Regardless, your mileage may vary. As you move around the game world, for the most part, you are taking in things from a third-person perspective, but you can also explore the environment in a first-person camera mode, where you can zoom in, it gives you a first-person view of your environment, and you can look around and see what you might be missing, because there are going to be certain things that might be hidden a little bit off the beaten path that you can't easily see in third-person mode. Switch to first-person mode, look around, and you might find another secret or another path to explore that you wouldn't have otherwise seen in third-person mode. Now, this platforming, and we kind of touched on the surface of the platforming piece, because the platforming is really a core component of the game, but the platforming will eventually be combined with combat to create some pretty crazy situations. I'm going to cover that when we get to the combat portion of our discussion. But overall, the platforming here, take the combat and put it off to the side. The platforming here is what I would call cool, but flawed. I don't know if it was the camera or the controls or maybe just me, but sometimes the simple act of jumping from platform to platform or running along a wall and trying to jump onto a platform to get to the next section of a stage was simply more challenging than I thought it should have been. I remember several times where I was running along a wall, which, by the way, is very cool. You're running along a wall because you're trying to get up to this platform, and you kind of run along the wall and then you jump because you have to jump onto this ledge, and then you randomly kind of jump away from the ledge and you end up falling and you have to redo that. There is one section a little bit later in the game where you kind of have to use the wall and jump from wall to wall to get higher and higher, because if you kick off of a wall as you're jumping or as you're running on it, you can jump to an even higher section of a wall. And if there's, say, a square room, you can kind of run from wall to wall and get higher as you go and eventually reach the top of the wall, and maybe there's a platform up there or whatever. There are sections of the game that are built entirely around these movement mechanics and the overall just platforming design of Ninja Gaiden Black. And I've got to say, the concept behind them is insanely awesome. Who wouldn't want to be a ninja, running around and jumping from wall to wall and getting up into higher locations? Or who wouldn't want to be a ninja that's doing flips from one platform to the next, or hanging off of ledges, or doing all sorts of acrobatic maneuvers? It sounds amazing. In practice, the platforming is way more challenging than it has any right being, and from my perspective, that's primarily an issue with the camera and the controls, neither of which I felt really captured the real feeling of what you wanted. I mean, you did feel like a ninja as you played the game and jumped around and did all this kind of stuff, but I didn't really feel like the controls or the camera gave you the best chance at success. This is definitely an evolved form of 3D platforming than you would see in prior titles like from the Nintendo 64 era, just as an example. But because Ninja Gaiden's overall movement and pace is much more quick than some of those games, it creates a situation where you can really tell that the developers didn't fully have this figured out yet. I'm not suggesting that it's bad, but it is definitely flawed. And honestly, I never felt, as I was navigating the different environments of the game, I never felt that I ever had true precision to any of my platforming, at least for the first 2/3 or so of the game. Eventually, and I think you would do this too, I did get used to it. I bet you will get used to it too if you keep playing the game. So the last third of the game actually felt like a much better experience, but regardless, the platforming never felt super tight to me. And the platforming is a core component of the game, so it is something you're going to have to get used to, and if you don't, you're going to have a little bit of a tough time. Anyway, putting the platforming aside, let's talk about the combat, because the combat, from my perspective, is probably the best part of Ninja Gaiden Black by far. And the fact is that there is a super deep combat system included with the game. First of all, you do have multiple weapons you can select from, each of which have very different attacks, and can often be upgraded to do more damage as you play the game. You have strong weapons, you have quick weapons, you have balanced weapons. There is a ton of variety here. But this isn't a simple matter of having different swing animations for different weapons, because the game's combat system is built on top of a very deep combo system, similar to what you might see in traditional tournament fighting games. This is not an example of a game where you can simply mash buttons and hope to win. I mean, sure, you can technically do that, but you're not going to be nearly as effective as if you actually explore the game's combo system, because you can string all sorts of attacks together when you start using those combos. You can start stringing your light and heavy attacks together. You might be able to jump mid-combat, include a series of special moves as you continue to play the game, and as you platform around the game world. And a lot of times when you combine these combos with the overall combat, and you include the platforming that's included with the game, you will be able to do so to devastating effect, at least for your opponents. What makes the system so good is the way the game makes you feel like a true ninja. You're not expected to simply stand on the ground and bash away at your enemies. No, you're expected to jump around the environment like an oversized Yoda, bouncing off of walls, jumping off of enemy heads, slashing down with mega hit combos, dodging incoming blows, deflecting opponents' attacks, and counterattacking opponents' weaknesses, oftentimes all in the same battle. The concepts behind this battle system are amazing, and when things mesh together the way you want them to, you will feel like a supreme being of agile destruction. And that's not even to mention the other aspects of the combat system other than simply swinging your weapon in countless ways, like the game's magic system known as Ninpo, or the various items you can potentially equip that change certain aspects of the game, like the armlet system, which you can wear different types of armlets which can confer different buffs and bonuses on your character, like additional attack damage, or you can even talk about the ranged combat system, which includes such items as shurikens, bows and arrows, and incendiary devices. When you combine all of those things into a single combat engine, you get a recipe for awesomeness. That said, getting to a level of proficiency where you won't feel overmatched takes a lot of time. And actually, now's probably a good time to talk about learning the game, which applies mostly to the game's combat and platforming systems. When I first started playing Ninja Gaiden Black, and recall when I was talking earlier, when I played Ninja Gaiden Black when I was younger, I kind of bounced off the game fairly hard because I was playing it and it just felt hard. I mean, it just didn't feel like the kind of game that I wanted to spend a ton of time playing. It just seemed a little bit too challenging, the controls a little bit too imprecise, and for whatever reason, I just didn't want to stick with it back when I was younger. When I sat down to begin playing Ninja Gaiden Black today, for today's episode of the podcast, I honestly had a similar kind of reaction. I tried to navigate around the environment. I tried to follow the little in-game tips about how to jump from platform to platform or run along walls and attack enemies and all that kind of stuff. And as I was playing the game, it just didn't feel the way I wanted it to feel. It felt like an experience that, yeah, I can kind of get the concept of what the developers were going for, but it didn't feel nearly as good as a modern gaming experience using that same kind of setup, where if you had a modern game that was designed really well using ninjas, and admittedly, I did not play the latest Ninja Gaiden that was released, so it's very possible that all of this stuff is included in that modern release. But talking specifically about Ninja Gaiden Black, as I was playing it, it just didn't feel the way I wanted it to feel. And I was really disappointed when I first started playing the game. And I started thinking to myself, well, I'm getting similar feelings now as what I did when I was younger. But of course, the whole purpose of looking at this game today was to push through any of that and to see if my initial impressions were flawed or if my initial impressions were valid. Because as you all know, when I sit down to play a game for the podcast, I will play it through to completion. So my initial impressions were not all that great. I mean, I could see the goodness here. It just didn't feel all that good to play. But then I kept playing it, and I kept playing it, and I kept playing it some more. I played Ninja Gaiden Black a lot, and it took me a very long time to get beyond the whole, hey, this is kind of a cool concept, but ultimately flawed, until eventually I got to the point of actual proficiency, where I began to have fun playing the game. Now, there will be pieces as you're playing the game or moments playing the game that you will find fun, and those individual moments are the things that will keep propelling you forward. As an example, in an early stage of the game, you'll go into this airship kind of thing. And at that point, by the time I got there, I was kind of feeling a little overmatched. I was kind of feeling like, oh, I don't know if this is the thing for me, but I continued to play. And then I was able to string together a couple of cool combos, and one where I kind of dashed across the screen and then decapitated an enemy, and not to be overly violent, but I mean, that is in the game. So I ran across the screen, I decapitated an enemy, and then I jumped off a wall, and then I slashed another enemy and was able to kill him. And at that moment, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I could see the potential here. Now I can see the potential. Now, granted, I probably got lucky in that scenario because I still wasn't fully into and understanding the controls and all the different combos and things like that I could potentially pull off. But that moment gave me reason to continue playing because I saw what the potential was. You will have these different moments as you play through the game where you might pull off something randomly, or you might have some sort of cool combo, or you might dispatch a series of enemies without taking a hit. And then you will start to see the potential of what lies beyond if you can actually take the time to become proficient with the game. Those moments are what continue to push me forward. And eventually, after spending a lot of time with the game, you will become proficient with the platforming and the combat system, and you will eventually begin to really enjoy it. There are some combat inconsistencies that you'll encounter as you play the game. There are certain issues from my perspective with the block and counter system that's included with the game. There's also sometimes you're going to hit some or reach some enemies where they will literally spam ranged attacks at you. The combo system can be a little finicky sometimes, but at the end of the day, assuming that you do take the time to really learn the game and continue to play through the game, you will eventually become proficient and most likely will begin enjoying the overall experience. Putting all that aside and putting aside the learning curve required to get to the point of actual proficiency, the combat system in Ninja Gaiden Black is amazing. And I can certainly see why tons of people consider this to be pinnacle action platforming kind of gameplay, especially the combat portion of the entire experience. It is built upon a solid foundation, and once you learn it, you will feel like a ninja. The third aspect of the game that we need to talk about is the adventuring portion of the overall experience, because while you will be jumping and slashing and flipping your way through the entire world, there's also some adventure game elements included here. You do explore an interconnected world throughout your gameplay that, while not truly open world, is kind of an open world kind of experience. There are scene transitions across many of the game's locations, so you're not really walking from scene to scene or location to location without any sort of load times or things like that. But the fact is that those transitions never take you out of the action, and I thought the game's designers did a great job in hiding how different sections of the game would load in the background, creating the feel of an open world kind of game, even though the game itself was not truly open world. The interconnectivity of different locations found throughout the game is awesome, and really does kind of impart that overall feeling of being in a much larger world where different sections of a city, just as an example, might connect together. There are plenty of areas where you'll find shortcuts that connect later game areas with earlier game areas. And the city hub, so to speak, that you will spend a good portion of your time playing in gives you an opportunity to revisit different places from earlier in the game later in the game, and sometimes those places have changed, or new enemies are there, or new challenges are there that you have to overcome. And it really does create a feeling that you're exploring a real world, because this city that acts as a hub for a good portion of the game, it spreads out in all sorts of directions. And as you unlock different shortcuts to connect back, or you find different objects or items or whatever that might give you options to explore that city and even areas that you may have explored before, even in more depth, it does create a feeling. It's almost creates a little bit of a Metroidvania kind of feel, not truly, but it does add a little bit of that additional spice that makes the overall gameplay experience that much more enticing. Now, what I didn't expect when I started playing the game is the fact that in different areas of the game, and as you continue to play and progress through the overall game, there's almost kind of a Resident Evil styled slice of adventuring included here for good measure. You might find some locked doors that has a symbol on it, and you have to find the right key with the right symbol, which anybody who's played Resident Evil knows That's kind of a staple of that entire gaming franchise. We did see a little bit of that here in Ninja Gaiden Black, and it immediately reminded me of a Resident Evil styled adventure where you find a door and it might have a symbol of something on it, and you need to find the specific key that unlocks that door, and you might not find that key for hours later. It might take you hours to finally find that key, and then you remember, oh wait, I had this door that I couldn't open before. Now I have the key to that door with the symbols that match. Now I can go back and explore that area and probably find an entirely new section of the game world or progress further into the game. So I did enjoy that kind of thing, and I really do enjoy the concept of a hub kind of environment. Actually, another game that this kind of reminds me of a little bit with the whole hub kind of concept, just a little bit, is Dark Souls, because in Dark Souls, you have effectively a hub kind of location that spreads out into several different locations, and you'll explore those other locations. They might fold back upon themselves, you'll have different shortcuts unlocked, and then eventually you end up right back at your starting location. Similar kind of experience here, not quite the same, but definitely a similar kind of concept with Ninja Gaiden Black. The adventuring aspect of the game in general, while light, was very cool to experience, and I do wonder what a more adventure-centric, less combat-heavy version of the game would look like. Personally, I would eat that experience up, because I love adventure-styled gameplay, and I think the concept of exploring a world as a ninja with some combat sprinkled in, but not having combat being the core part of the overall experience, I think that sounds like an awesome idea. Think about a game like Hitman, like the Hitman series, where you're not meant to be a walking army of destruction as a singular person. You're meant to kind of sneak through the shadows and take out targets of opportunity. What if you had a ninja game that was like that, where you're not necessarily trying to kill everyone in sight, but you're trying to adventure through an environment, and maybe every now and then you got to take out a bad guy, but that's not the core focus of the experience. I know there have been ninja stealth games over time. Honestly, I haven't played many of them, so as an example, I know there's a game called Tenchu Ninja Assassin, which, just based on the name alone, sounds like it would be this kind of concept, but I've never played the game, so I can't speak on that authoritatively. If anybody has, let me know what games are out there that might give you more of a ninja stealth kind of experience versus a ninja combat kind of experience, because that concept, I think, would be truly awesome to experience, and if there's stuff out there, which I've got to believe there must be, but if there is, let me know what they are, and I would definitely like to experience those games. Anyway, when you combine the platforming, the combat, and the adventuring, you get the core framework of Ninja Gaiden Black. And that's not even really diving deep into the story, which is told across 16 chapters across multiple areas and including multiple cutscenes, dialogues, and in-game events. Or the mission mode, which consists of a bunch of bite-sized activities, most often involving killing every enemy that you face, taking place across different settings from the main story. Or the fact that there are multiple difficulties available to challenge interested gamers, assuming you unlock them first, all of which feature new enemies, reworked and harder boss encounters, and other tweaks to make each difficulty feel like a unique experience. There is a lot of game in Ninja Gaiden Black, and even after completing a single playthrough of the game's story and some of the game's mission mode content, which took me around 25 hours or so, I still felt like there was a lot left to experience, and most likely, those experiences would be even more fun than I had in my first playthrough, since now that I'm proficient with the game, it creates a much more enjoyable kind of feeling as I play the game. And certainly much better than when I was a noob trying to play through the game and getting my butt handed to me every chance the enemies got. We're going to talk more about what it feels like to play Ninja Gaiden Black, along with my own perspectives on various aspects of the game, in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Ninja Gaiden Black for the Microsoft Xbox console, The back of the box says, one of the best games of this console generation from GameSpy. Action-packed story. Exclusive new cinematic scenes revealed. Missions. Try your hand at 50 all-new missions, each providing relentless action and incredible challenges. Choose your difficulty. 5 levels of difficulty, from Ninja Dog to Master Ninja. Each difficulty level contains unique features, creating a whole new experience. Hurricane Pack content. New enemies and big bad bosses from both Hurricane Packs can be found throughout the game. Bonus content. Unlock the original arcade version of Ninja Gaiden, never before seen costumes, and more. Experience Ryu Hayabusa's deadly artistry in Ninja Gaiden Black, the biggest, baddest, fastest, and newest installment in the critically acclaimed Ninja Gaiden series. Ninja Gaiden Black is beautiful, says IGN. So that is the back of the box for Ninja Gaiden Black, and I've got to say, yeah, this one sells me. Oh, and of course, there are some screenshots on the back of the box as well. Yes, this box absolutely sells me on the game. One of the things that you'll notice as we're reading through the back of the box for this one is that this is kind of the definitive edition of Ninja Gaiden, the new 3D version of the series, because there are some assumptions made here that you understand that this is not the original release of Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox, but is kind of the authoritative combined version. They talk about the Hurricane Packs. They talk about the fact that there are new story elements added. They don't really tell you anywhere in the box that this is based off of or a kind of a refinement of the original Ninja Gaiden release. So the assumption is that you already know that going into the back of the box. Assuming you do, this makes perfect sense. If not, it might feel like you're kind of entering a conversation that's already been going and you're not really sure where you fit in that conversation, because there is no explanation there other than saying that it's the biggest, baddest, fastest, whatever version of the game. Yeah, I get that, but they could have probably been a little bit more specific just in case you did not realize that Ninja Gaiden Black was a definitive version release of Ninja Gaiden. Regardless, this box definitely sells me on the game. It makes it sound absolutely awesome. It makes it sound like it's chock full of content, which of course it actually is. Overall, I really enjoyed this box, and it is one that I would definitely see sitting on my shelf. I could certainly see buying the game. I do own the game. Like I talked about, I actually do own it. But it's one of those things that even today, I would probably buy it. Knowing a little bit more about it now, after spending more time with the game, I would still buy it. The box just looks cool, and the box really does explain itself relatively well with the overall game. So you pretty much know what you're going to get when you're going to start playing Ninja Gaiden Black if you read the back of the box, and the screenshots certainly look good. There's really nothing wrong with it. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of this particular box. Anyway, we're going to move past the box to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. Overall, the visuals in Ninja Gaiden Black are pretty darn great. Now, you can definitely tell that this isn't what I would call a modern title, but the power of the original Xbox is on full display here, with high-quality character and environmental graphics, spell and particle effects, and animations. The animations, by the way, bear special mentioning, because in a fast-paced 3D action title, you need smooth gameplay and animation in order to really feel immersed in the game. And let me tell you, Ninja Gaiden Black definitely hits the mark here. There are a bunch of different enemies in the game, and each one has their own animated sequences, all of which look great. And that's not even to mention all of the different moves that you, as Ryu Hayabusa, have at your disposal, all of which are animated superbly and look awesome. Bottom line, Ninja Gaiden Black looks great. Moving on to the sound and music, most of the music in Ninja Gaiden Black fades into the background, taking a backseat to the overall gameplay that you'll be experiencing. And in this case, the background is exactly where the music belongs. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that Ninja Gaiden Black's focus is undeniably the gameplay and trying to make you feel like a badass ninja who can defeat anyone in their path. The music included in the game works perfectly within that context, and there isn't a single bad track in the game. There's just also not a single track that I would call memorable. The music here is an accompaniment to the action on the screen, not a star in its own right, and honestly, that is perfectly fine from my perspective. Equally fine is the voice acting included in the game, which is surprisingly subdued given the action-oriented focus of the game. The best way I can describe the voice acting in Ninja Gaiden Black is solid. There's nothing here that I would call bad, but there's also nothing here that I would call out as being exceptionally well done. It's kinda like the kind of voice acting that you'd have in old-school dubbed Japanese films, albeit not as over the top as some of those dubs that can occasionally get, a little bit over the top. But in other words, the voice work here is fine, but almost certainly will not win any awards. Sound effects are similarly well done, match the action on the screen perfectly, and serve to enhance the feeling of playing the game. But as with many action titles, there's really not much more to say about the sound effects. All of the sound effects that you would expect are here, like the clanging of swords or the hefty thumps and thwacks that come along with combat scenes, and everything sounds really good. Bottom line, the auditory environment in Ninja Gaiden Black works very well, and I have no complaints about anything I heard playing the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Ryu Hayabusa, an incredibly talented ninja, and part of the famed Hayabusa Ninja Clan. That clan has long been the protector of the Dark Dragon Blade, an evil weapon forged from actual dragon bones that allow its wielder to bring death and destruction to the world. The Hayabusa clan have prevented that blade from falling into the wrong hands for years, and even have possession of the weapon's sister blade, the Dragon Sword, the only known counter to the evil Dark Dragon Blade, and a weapon that has been passed down from generation to generation, with its current custodian being you. One day, Hayabusa Village is attacked, and the Dark Dragon Blade is stolen. And obviously, you can't let that stand, because if the Dark Dragon Blade is wielded by an unscrupulous individual, devastation will follow. It is up to you to take matters into your own hands and save the day, as you run, jump, and slash your way through a huge number of enemies and environments, all in the hopes of recapturing the Dark Dragon Blade and preventing evil from ruining the world. Are you up to the challenge? There's only one way to find out. I've got to say, I really enjoyed the story here, which was pure over-the-top ninja action goodness, and was told via cutscenes that played before and after each chapter as you play through the game. Was it the deepest story I've ever experienced? Well, no, it wasn't, though it never needed to be. As an action-centric narrative featuring a badass ninja doing badass ninja things, though, it was pretty much perfect. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we've already talked about the general framework for the game along with the different mechanics that make up the majority of your playthrough, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. Instead, I'd like to focus just a bit more on the game's controls, along with some design decisions that I have some critique with. Starting with the controls, I will say that generally speaking, the platforming controls and mechanics feel a bit looser than they should, but the combat controls work really well with the game, at least from a purely combat perspective. I always felt like I had the appropriate tools at my disposal to tackle any of the challenges that I might face, but I will say that it will take some time to know when to block, and when to do a light attack, and when to do a heavy attack, and when to launch into a combo. But all of that learning isn't betrayed by the controls at all. The controls work, it's just that you need to develop some muscle memory before you'll become truly effective. That said, I do have a slight nitpick with the stylized pseudo-menu system that's used for your inventory, weapons, and spell list, which from my perspective, isn't quite as intuitive to navigate through as I would have liked. It's not the most awful thing, but I will readily admit that even after playing the game for 20-ish hours, there were still occasions where I'd access my inventory and mess up when navigating to my ranged weapons tab, just as an example, oftentimes resulting in my screen switching to a different view entirely. Now, it's entirely possible that this is a me problem, but I've played plenty of games across nearly every gaming genre at this point in my life, so I feel like I should be adept enough at playing games to not have a continued mental block on how to navigate a simple inventory system in an action game. It might be me, or it might be the game's inventory and menu design, which I do believe is less well laid out than it should have been. Moving past the menu system, which like I said isn't really that bad, we do need to talk about some of the enemies in the game, a couple of which I believe were designed by an absolutely insane person, because nobody in their right mind would believe fighting some of these enemies would ever be fun. The first enemy that made me rage a bit were what I would call explosive ninjas, who you'll meet fairly early in the game, and just love to toss explosive shurikens in your direction, occasionally even affixing those shurikens to your body. Once you become proficient enough with the game and its mechanics, you'll be able to deal with these guys without too much difficulty, but until then, you will curse them under your breath every time those jerks spawn on your screen. And actually, speaking of spawning, I don't think I mentioned the fact that some areas of different levels feature traps and specific sequences that cause enemies to spawn, and respawn again, occasionally feeling like an infinite wave of enemies to defeat. Most egregious are a couple of locations where enemies respawn right near a save point, and even if you beat those enemies before you saved your game, they'll be respawned and ready to attack you after you load your game. Assuming you have a sizable amount of hit points, that might not be a huge deal, but occasionally, you might reach a save point with a sliver of health and minimal restorative items in your inventory. And let me tell you, loading your game and then getting immediately attacked by a pack of enemies that you previously defeated isn't all that fun. Compared to the ghost fish you'll encounter later in the game though, getting a surprise kick to the nuts by an unexpected enemy respawn feels like a day at the spa. Ghost fish. Ghost fish are evil creatures whose existence is a blight on humanity. These devil spawn attack in packs, often swarming you, and if they manage to hit you, you'll become stunned just long enough for the rest of the pack to close the distance and attack you as well, which stuns you again, and will make you lose a ridiculous amount of health if you can't extract yourself from that situation. These fish are my least favorite enemies in the entire game, and are on my short list for worst enemies in any game. They absolutely suck, and nobody will ever convince me otherwise. Most of the other enemies in the game are fine, though I also dislike the way some bosses will become invincible to certain attacks for a period of time, like say your jump dash slash attack that allows you to fly around the battlefield and absolutely destroy the enemies in your path. Look, I get it. Bosses should be hard, and you shouldn't be able to trivialize them by flying around the battlefield faster than they can respond to you. I'm just saying, I would have rather the boss had to execute an actual block for that move with a low possibility of failure, as opposed to simply becoming invincible to damage from that move while leaving the player with no recourse. It's a minor thing, but it was a bit of an irritant. Oh, and you know what else can be irritating? Packs of bazooka firing bad guys, because on occasion, those bad guys will time their attacks in a way that could potentially lock you into a never-ending barrage of missiles, which are difficult to avoid. I know, holding block will reduce the damage you take, and generally speaking, utilizing block is going to be one of the most important skills you'll learn as you play the game, because other than certain unblockable moves, most combat encounters in the game feature enemies and moves that can be blocked. I completely understand the block mechanic. I'm just saying, being able to mitigate the damage from certain encounters doesn't mean that those encounters aren't designed poorly to start with. Oh, and lest anyone think otherwise, Ghostfish cannot be blocked. Seriously, Ghostfish, you suck. Anyway, aside from those critiques, as well as some of the critiques I levied earlier about the platforming aspects of the game, the majority of Ninja Gaiden Black is an awesome experience. And once you get used to the game and its mechanics, you're almost guaranteed to have a good time. It won't be an easy time, but you should have some fun with this one. So, what is our overall verdict on Ninja Gaiden Black? Well, Ninja Gaiden Black is a quality action title, and when everything clicks, you're going to end up experiencing the kind of ninja action that very few games can deliver. It's hard-hitting, it's challenging, it's deep, it's immersive. All of those things are good, and the majority of Ninja Gaiden Black is a good experience. That being said, There are some design decisions that I believe don't feel all that great to experience, and while I appreciate the depth of the combat engine along with all of the different combos you can potentially execute, I believe that depth can at times make the game feel less approachable than I'd prefer. Some enemy encounters will truly test your patience, and unless you've studied all of the combos available for your weapon of choice, expect to be outmatched, especially before you're fully proficient with the game's combat system. Even after you're proficient with the game's combat, there will still be times where you'll feel outmatched, with some of those occasions being driven by artificial difficulty and poor design decisions, like the previously mentioned Ghostfish, which truly is one of the worst enemies I've experienced in a game ever. Regardless of those critiques though, Ninja Gaiden Black is still a quality game. It's just not one I can recommend without some reservations. If you're looking for a challenging experience that requires your full attention and dedication to conquer, and you can deal with some janky platforming and unfair enemy encounters, then I wholeheartedly recommend Ninja Gaiden Black, and I think you'll have a ton of fun. If, however, you're looking for an over-the-top action experience that doesn't require you to build a ton of muscle memory just to have a chance at surviving the game's encounters, then I would probably steer clear of Ninja Gaiden Black, because it is not a simple experience, and you will need to focus in order to become skilled enough to overcome the game's challenges. What this all means is that Ninja Gaiden Black is a good game, but not one that I believe will be universally loved, which is why I feel comfortable adding Ninja Gaiden Black to our list of golden oldies. If you want a challenging and deep combat experience that makes you feel like an honest-to-goodness badass ninja, then this game is for you. If you prefer your action beat-em-up titles to be a bit more on the simple side, then I think you might bounce off of the game fairly quickly. What I can guarantee though, is that if you stick with it, you will find a good game here, and I can therefore safely say that Ninja Gaiden Black is absolutely deserving of its spot in our collection of golden oldies. It is now time for this week's set of gaming challenges, and they are all, of course, focused on Ninja Gaiden Black. Your first challenge, worth a single coin, is to defeat a talented sensei. You will encounter a sensei very early in your story. If you can defeat him, you will earn 1 coin. Your second coin is to take a ride in an airship. Relatively early in the story mode playthrough, you will eventually encounter an airship and you'll have to fight your way through that airship. If you can reach that stage, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, your third challenge, worth 3 coins, is to destroy a tentacled demon. Eventually, as you play through the game, things will get a little weird, because all of those humanoid enemies that you once encountered, you're going to start facing some demonic enemies as well. If you can find and defeat your first tentacled demon, then you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Ninja Gaiden Black. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Super Star Wars, so definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Super Star Wars. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.